Folks, this is Julie Flanagan. She is the Prince William County Arborist. And she's going to lead this presentation.
All right. Thank you, Brendan. And welcome to the final talk for today. Just before I get started, if you do have some additional questions from any of the sessions that you've attended, we will continue with the Zoom meeting for half an hour at the end of this. And so I think maybe not all, but most of our speakers will be available to ask additional questions of. And I think that's going to be moderated, so it shouldn't be too chaotic, but we did that last time and it worked really nice. We had a good time. So we're going to talk about selecting trees for life. And in my talk today, we're going to talk a lot about individual trees. But I think probably by now you have gotten the sense of how interconnected life is. And so rather than, as we go through this and you're thinking about a particular tree for your property, keep in mind or think about how you're going to fit that tree into a community, because trees do live in community. They can live in community with other plants. The understory, we're going to talk about overstory and understory trees, but other plants in the community, there's the shrubs, there's mosses, there's herbaceous plants, there's fungi, there's all sorts of things. And then there's all the animals that live there, the birds, the interesting animals, some of which we might not even be familiar with, like the southern flying squirrel. This little cutie lives in Northern Virginia in our forests, and you may come across it. It's very nocturnal. But every so often you see one, and we might not even be aware that they're in our woods, but they're in our woods. And they need that community of organisms for them to make a living. And then things like box turtles and fascinating looking insects like the giant leopard moth and its larva, which is called a woolly bear. These are all part of a forest system. And if we're going to be, if you want your yard to be the best it can be in terms of being productive for nature, then you want to think about how you can build that community, and that starts with the plants. So we're going to start, well, I'm going to just mention the 5 parts or the 5 basic layers of a forest. The overstory, which is the high, dense, leafy canopy. Excuse me, the understory, which are small tree species, a combination of small tree species that never get big, and overstory species that just haven't made it into the top layer of the canopy yet. The shrub layer, which is the lowest woody layer, and then the herbaceous layer, which can vary greatly depending upon the forest type and the geology of the area. But that's also where we see a lot of our beautiful wildflowers. And then the leaf litter layer, which is it's a dead vegetative layer. It's where the dead leaves and other kinds of dead organic matter wind up in the leaf litter. And then, as we've mentioned, it's the dead leaf litter, but it's not dead in terms of life. It is full of all sorts of different kinds of life. So think about, as we're talking about these, we're going to talk about the overstory and the understory trees. But think about how you might be able to use those in conjunction with these other parts of the forest system. So starting at the top with the high canopy. There are at least 50 different species of trees, overstory trees, that are native to the Northern Virginia area, DC metro area. These are the major producers of biomass. And we've been hearing about how important leafy biomass is to the life of, kind of as a foundation for the whole ecosystem. And because these trees are so large, they are the major producers of that biomass. And so they can be very valuable. This is the typical shade tree that you think of putting in your yard. And it's also, because they are so large, they also often have a very significant influence on other trees and plants and life around them because of the shade they cast, because of the space they take up. So because they are so big, you want to really think about how you're going to place them. The choices that you make for what species you choose, if you choose one of these overstory trees, you really need to think about, does it have enough canopy space to grow in? And does it have enough rooting space to grow in? Excuse me. So you might be familiar with this list. This is from Douglas Tallamy, and it is his top 10, actually there's 9 of them on here, so I'm not quite sure why it says 10. The most valuable woody plant species. for supporting Lepidoptera. The ones that are in white are basically overstory species. And so their importance to some degree is linked to their size. It's also linked to how many different species of that particular genus there are in our area. The ones that are in green are the understory species. And the ones, and I'm going to focus on this list, although I'm not going to hit two of these genera. I'm not going to talk about Populus or Malus, but I am going to talk about the other ones that are in here. And you can just see how many hundreds of lepidopters are supported in the eastern United States from these genera. Let's start with willow oak, one of my favorite trees, Quercus phellos. As I go through this, I'm going to talk about height, or you'll see height and spread. And then you're going to see, some of the times you'll see parentheses next to those. So in this case, height 40 to 60 feet. That's the height that the plant typically gets when it's growing in a suburban setting. And then in parentheses is the height it can get to when it's in a really favorable environment. Basically, it's what it can do in a forested environment where it likes that particular forest type, for that particular geology or the climate or the position on the slope and things like that. So chances are you're not going to get that if you're growing this in your yard. You're going to get the first numbers, the 40 to 60 feet. So willow oak can handle wet to moist soils. So think about that in your yard. What do you have in terms of moisture? It needs full sun, but can take partial shade. Its fall color is not particularly outstanding. It has yellow to a rusty red fall color. It has very high wildlife value. It's excellent for the Lepidoptera, as we've already noted, and it produces acorns. It produces a small acorn that's hard massed for many of the winter resident birds and mammals that we have in our area. And you can see that in the lower right here, you see the leaf, which is why it gets its name. So willow oak is called willow oak, not because it's a willow, but because it's an oak that has a leaf that looks like a willow. This is a species you probably want to avoid planting in the fall because I'm not sure why, but it has a very high mortality rate when it's planted in the fall. So plant it in the spring, but it is an excellent tree. And you can see, I don't know where to put this. Let's put that up there. You can see on how very large it can get. All right, next is southern red oak, Quercus falcata. It gets pretty tall even in a suburban setting with 70 to 80 feet in height and a pretty good spread too. This one can actually handle pretty dry. Everything we're going to talk about can handle moist. So I'm just going to mention sort of the other end of the spectrum. It can handle dry soils. It does need full sun. Its color in the fall can be a fairly good rusty brown or just plain brown. Again, all the oaks are going to have high wildlife value, high value for Lepidoptera, high value for mammals and birds. This species in particular can tolerate poor and dry soils, and it does have a tendency to hold its leaves well into winter. So if you thought you were going to get them all raked up in early November, well, it might be January when you're raking these guys up. White oak, one of the queens of the forest, Quercus alba, grows 80 to 100 feet tall, and in nature can get over 100 feet tall. It can handle moist to dry soils, and this can handle a little bit of shade. The colors can be anywhere from a brown to a rusty red to wine. And just pointing out that spread, let me go back to that for just a second. This lower right image is a white oak that is unfortunately now dead because it's succumbed to oak decline. But you can see how much this very mature oak took up the entire front lawn because it was open grown. And that's something to keep in mind. The more open grown your tree is, the more it's going to spread horizontally with its branches. The more it has to compete with other trees for sunlight, the more it's going to grow upright and go vertical and not spread out. And so keep that in mind when you're thinking about placement. White oak is not necessarily very available in the nurseries, but you can always plant it as an acorn, and those are free. Go out and find them in the woods, collect a bunch of them, find out which ones don't have holes in them and are good, and then you can follow some simple steps to plant those either in a pot and then put them out later on as a young sprout, or just plant them in the ground and protect them from the squirrels. Red maple, leaving the oaks now, is a very large, can be a very large tree, 40 to 60 feet in height, and oftentimes with a broad spread to it. It can handle wet to moist soils and likes full sun to partial shade. Also good for Lepidoptera. One of the nice things about the red maple is that it flowers very early in the spring. The picture, this grayish picture, is a spring an image taken in the spring, when probably around the end of March. And some of these red maples were blooming with red flowers and some were blooming with more orangey flowers. And they give this very subtle beauty to the forest or to your yard that's really lovely, but something you have to actually look for. Because they flower so early, they also fruit early. And so they become an important early season source of food for many animals. And they're very adaptable. They are probably one of the big overstory trees. They're among the ones that are most bred for everything from the shape and size, and particularly for fall color. So you can find cultivars of this that are bred specifically for brilliant fall color. American elm, this used to be not so long ago. This was not even available in the nurseries because of Dutch elm disease. But now there are at least two, I list them here, Valley Forge and New Harmony, that have been bred to be highly, and these are fully native, not hybrids, but they are fully native and highly resistant to Dutch elm disease. This image in the right here, one time I grew up in a neighborhood that had elms lining the streets and creating this wonderful shady canopy, and that disappeared with Dutch elm disease. But now with these resistant varieties, we can get them back into our communities again. And they are highly productive in terms of food for insects at the foundation of the food web, with over 500 insects utilizing American elm. Scarlet oak. Now we're going to jump down to medium deciduous trees. These are trees that are going to be a little bit smaller, although this one right here looks like it probably should be in the large category. But anyway, 70 to 75 feet in height with 40 to 50 feet in spread. Scarlet oak is one of those trees that can handle dry soils. And this is one of the oaks that you can actually get some really good fall color from, scarlet to russet red. As with all the oaks, very good for wildlife. It may be a little bit difficult to find for sales. So if you can't find it in nurseries, you can always do oaks, acorns, and you can find them oftentimes as seedlings. Swamp white oak, 40 to 60 feet in height. It has an interesting acorn with a long, this is called the peduncle, this long stem. Brendan, confirm for me, you guys can see my cursor, right?
Yes, we can, Julie.
Okay, good. I'm just pointing to things you can't see that I'm pointing to. All right, good. So full sun to part shade with this. It is very drought resistant, and so it can be used in areas where you might have really tough soils that are going to be prone to drought. Black cherry, one of my favorites. This is a native large tree. It's not one of the little ornamental trees. It gets to be a very large tree, 40 to 60 feet in height. 20, not so much in the spread, 20 to 30 feet in the spread, and it likes moist to dry soils with full sun. The fall color usually is yellow, and sometimes you can get a reddish tint to it. It does produce cherries, and those are, you might be concerned about messiness with the cherries, but I think probably you're not going to have a problem with that because they are so desired by birds that the birds are probably going to pick them clean before they have a chance to drop to the ground. And this is also, just as an FYI, if you love cherry wood, cherry furniture, cherry cabinets, this is the tree that produces that wood. Sweet gum, liquid ambar styrosiflua. If you love fall color, you probably want this tree in your yard. There's this 5-pointed leaf. It's very distinctive, and the fruit is very distinctive as well, called a gumball, sweet gumball. The fall color on this tree is spectacular. It can be anything from a yellow to, I've seen purples so dark that they almost look black. And this spread here up to 50 to 80 feet. I honestly have never seen one that wide. Most of the sweet gums I see are definitely in the 30 to 40-foot range. Can handle wet to moist soils. It tends to be a pioneering species, so it can do well if you're going to put it into, say, like a old field situation or something along that lines. This is winter food for a lot of songbirds and ducks. I've watched black-capped chickadees high in the canopy of a sweet gum picking seeds out of those gumballs that are still attached to the tree. And it's a fast grower. River birch, very popular, widely used in our communities. This is our only native birch in Prince William. I can't say our only. We have rare sightings of black birch, but I've only seen it like twice in all of Prince William County. But this is much more commonly used and commonly available in the nurseries. It can be bought either as a single stem or multi-stemmed. It can handle the river birch. You usually see it along wet areas, and so it can handle wet to moist soils. It needs full sun to part shade. Yellow tends to be the fall color. And again, excellent for Lepidoptera. The peely bark is interesting because a lot of insects will hide in there. And so you may find that you see a brown creeper or a white-breasted nuthatch that's patrolling the bark of your river birch looking for insects that are trying to hide amongst all those folds in the bark. And the bark on the river birch isn't always this orange. Oftentimes in nature, you see it more of a gray, but there are cultivars, which are all native, I should say they're bred to be native cultivars that are profoundly orange and beautiful in that sense. And one of the ones that I'm familiar with is called the Heritage River Birch. Black gum is a beautiful fall color, brilliant scarlet red, sometimes orange colors. Normally in the forest, we see this in the understory, but it does have the ability to bust out and get up really tall and really high and join the overstory trees, although it's pretty uncommon for us to see that. The fruit is rarely seen, I think, because one, the tree doesn't produce a ton of fruit, but also because the birds tend to eat it up and mammals also will consume it. Best like the willow oak to plant this one in the spring just to avoid a little risk of higher mortality for fall plantings. And then black willow. This is a tree you want to think about if you're naturalizing an area or if you're just tolerant of a tree that kind of has its own mind and tends to arch out and lean, form leans, and maybe will be multiple stemmed. It's a kind of a rangy wild tree, but it is very productive with regard to birds, Lepidoptera, food for all these different, and bees, as we were watching or listening to Sam Drogi earlier, that it's a good bee plant as well. This is one of our few plants that can actually live in standing water in very wet and swampy areas. So if you've got a wet area like that, it's a really good one. Some people would take a non-native like a weeping willow and put that in that area. This is a far better choice. Native, just better, better choice overall. I find it to be very birdy. When I go looking for birds, I photograph birds, and if I hang around a willow, I can guarantee you I'm going to find a good collection of birds that are checking it out, particularly when it's in flower and they're looking for bugs in those flowers. Now we're going to switch down to the understory. So these are going to be the smaller trees that never get big, and they always live in the understory. These can be really important for you to add to your property because a large number of our resident breeding birds, not our resident birds, but our breeding birds will nest in the understory. The understory, the shrub layer, and even the ground layer of the forest are the primary breeding areas for many bird species. The overstory does have breeding birds in it, but you find more a higher percentage of them are going to be in the understory, the shrub layer. So first is a plant we all know very well, probably flowering dogwood, Cornus florida. It has white flowering varieties and pink flowering varieties. And both of them are absolutely gorgeous. The fruit is really productive and really helpful for migrating birds because it is produced and ripens in the fall. So it's a very good source of food for migrating birds. Don't plant this in full sun. A lot of people do because you get spectacular flowering with it, but that's also something that stresses the tree quite a bit. So a good place to put it is someplace where it's going to have morning sun and afternoon shade. that would be the best. And not like 6-8 hours of sun, but maybe more like 4 hours of sun and then shade. Redbud is next. Beautiful pink flowers. This plant is in the pea family, and it has a pea-like flower that's very small, but it can be very profuse, and so you can get a beautiful effect from it. This can handle drier soils and full sun to partial shade. Good for bees and butterflies and songbirds, and it's very adaptable to a lot of different soil types, but it doesn't like to get its feet wet, so keep it out of a really wet spot. Has that heart-shaped leaf, which is very familiar. That leaf there is not the color during the summer, it is the color during when it's emerging. So that can be really interesting to look at as well. Downy serviceberry, Amelanchier arborea, 15 to 25 feet in height, handles a great variety of soils from wet to moist to dry. Needs full shade to partial shade. Doesn't really care to be out in full sun. And the fall colors can range from usually yellow, but sometimes peachy or even red. And there's over 50 species of wildlife that really like this fruit of this. And like the red maple, it produces its fruit early in the summer, and therefore it has value because a lot of our trees don't produce their fruit until the fall. So this one, having an earlier production of fruit, has that early summer value to it. And we can eat it. So you might find some recipes that you might like to try serviceberry with. Pawpaw, another edible fruit. And actually, my understanding is that in the eastern United States, it is our largest native edible fruit. Tastes something like, I kind of describe it as a mango banana custard with a little bit of an acidic kick to it. So it's the trees don't usually produce their fruit in any large quantities, but they are very desirable for a variety of birds and mammals. It does tend to sucker. And so if you put this one out there, you might be ready to see little sprouts coming up from the sides of your planting. And so if you give it some room to do that in, that's probably a good idea. Naturally, you'll see this in the most quantities in stream valleys. And it has a very interesting flower that's not really showy. Doesn't produce tons of them, but it is a pretty neat purple flower. Starts out green and turns deep, really maroon. Chokecherry, kind of like the willow oak. The chokecherry is and like the pawpaw, it can sprout it. It can creep in turn, sucker and form colonies. So if you're going to use this one, which is a really good plant, but if you're going to use it, you probably want to either make sure you've given it some room so it can start to sucker, or control those suckers. Just realize you're going to have to do some maintenance with that. Really nice fall color from yellow to red to purple. Most of the time I see it in the red and purple range, and can handle a moist soil. And then, even though the name chokecherry might think that it's something poisonous about it, it's actually not. And it's put enough sugar in it, and you can make it into a jam or a jelly. It is not a long-lived tree, so maybe 20, 25 years, and it's basically done. Now we're going to move on to evergreen trees, and we'll do some large evergreens and then some medium evergreens or small. I can't remember which we did, but anyway, height. The loblolly pine. Now loblolly is in Northern Virginia, here in Prince William County and Fairfax County. We really have not had loblolly occurring naturally until probably just in the last 15 to 20 years, when I've really been noticing that there's a lot of volunteer seedlings coming in. Normally, you would drive down to around Fredericksburg and you'd start seeing it occurring naturally in the forest, but it does seem to be creeping northward, and we're finding it coming up more and more in our areas and growing quite well. It has high value to birds, both because, and mammals, and probably also bees because of the pollen, but mostly because of the seeds. And you see a little red-breasted nuthatch down here taking advantage of those loblolly pine nuts that are tucked inside the scales of the cone. White pine, I'm going to put a caveat on this one. If our friends are listening that are more to the north of us, if you are maybe more in the mountains, then white pine could be a good choice for you. Can be a very large and very long-lived tree, 75 to 100 feet in cultivation and over 150 feet in nature. It can live to be 400 years old when it's in a happy spot. But in Northern Virginia, because we have really compacted soils, because we have a lot of heavy clay soils, because a lot of the areas where these get planted are prone to air pollution and to road salts, they really don't do well in our area. I rarely see one that lives more than about 20 years before it succumbs to all these different factors that it's sensitive to. So it's very sensitive to air pollution, road salts, compacted soils. So if you can bring it into a more wild, natural area, and if you're further to the north, this is going to be a really good selection for you. Pitch pine, Pinus rigida, 40 to 60 feet in height, can handle dry soils. This one actually can handle difficult soils in general. So either just if you have a poor quality soil, either on the dry sandy side or even on the wet peaty side, pitch pine can do well with that. Now it can handle a nice soil as well, but if you've got a difficult spot, you might want to think about using pitch pine. Eastern red cedar, you know, I find some people are not very fond of Eastern red cedar. I love it. I think it's one of my favorite trees. This is just a tough plant. It can also live very long, 40 to 50 feet in height, 75 at the outside, and 10 to 20 feet. You can find it skinny little red cedars, and you can find very broadly shaped red cedars. It does need full sun. It can only handle shade when it's very young, and as it ages, it must have full sun. The berries are one of the big draws to this because they are consumed by many different species of birds. And being an evergreen tree and very dense, it also provides cover. Birds and other animals need places to hide so they can feel safe. And so a tree like this can help provide cover for those plants. It can handle really lousy soils, but it cannot handle wet soils. It can make a great screen or a windbreak. It's a very tough tree. There is one disease that you might be concerned about, and that's cedar apple rust. It really does not do any harm to the red cedar, but it's a disease that hops from one host to another. So when it's on the cedar, it's almost inconspicuous. When it's on apple, it can form those little spots on the apple that can make an apple at least visually undesirable, if not unpalatable. This is a good choice to use in place of native Leyland cypress. Leyland cypress is not native anywhere. Not in the entire world is a native. Leyland cypress is native. It's a hybrid of two different genera, so it doesn't even exist in the natural world. But this is a good alternative to that. Also, this comes in male and female. So there are female red cedars and there are male red cedars. And if you want berries, you need to have the female red cedar with a male somewhere not too far away. American holly is going to be our next one. It comes in male and female. So again, if you want to have a female American holly, you can try and get that a couple different ways. One is buy a few of them, and chances are one of them is going to be female. The other is see if you can work with a nursery. Some of the really good nurseries may be able to tell you whether or not they've been bred, or this has been in some way, maybe it flowered at some point, or it was a clone and we knew the parent was a female and therefore this one's female, that kind of thing. Can handle acidic soils, and of course they're just plain beautiful. Arborvitae, technically not native to Northern Virginia. Its range is just to the north and west of us, more in the mountains, but it does very well in our area, and I think we're safe in using it and having it be a part of our ecosystem. 20 to 30 feet in height at max. I think I've definitely seen some even in suburban settings that have gotten to be 40 feet tall. Another good alternative to Leyland cypress, and this one is bred kind of like the red maple. It's bred to be everything from a little short meatball of a shrub to a 40-foot tall skinny tree to a 40-foot tall broad tree. So pay attention to the cultivars. There are numerous of them, and anyway, good choice. It is prone to bagworms. Okay, now we're moving down to the small evergreen trees. This one might not be so familiar to people. Sweet bay magnolia, Magnolia virginiana. Work toward the northern extension of this plant. As you move southward, it's going to get bigger. It likes the warmer climate. So 10 to 20 feet is where it would grow around here, but it does get taller as you move southward. It can handle wet to moist soil, so that's a good choice for any wet spot you might have. And it's very adaptable to full sun all the way down to full shade. Very good for songbirds and beneficial insects. In our area, because we're sort of toward the colder end of it, it may be semi-evergreen, meaning that if you have a warmer winter, it'll probably hold its leaves through the winter. If you have a cold winter, probably like we've had this winter, you may find that some of the leaves or all of the leaves will drop off of it, and then it will simply bloom again. And the flowers are lemon scented, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find a more beautiful flower than that. All right, so that's it for our trees. I just want to throw in, as we talked about at the start, that there are, as you think about your yard and you think about making it more ecologically productive, think about these other layers that are natural to our forest so that we can begin building those community of plants that really foster a more holistic and healthy environment. So this is just a list of a few of the shrubs that are native in the Northern Virginia area. Most of these are available in a typical nursery. Possibly with the exception of something like bladdernut and maybe some of the I don't know, I think even the azaleas you'd be able to find. So think about bringing those into your yard. And then the next layer down is the herbaceous layer. We have we're just getting ready to come into spring, and spring is like the time when our herbaceous layer shines the most brightly within this is the forest herbaceous layer. And we have so many beautiful spring wildflowers, and many of them, on this particular image, the three, I know for a fact you can get the toadshade, the foam flower, and the bloodroot in nurseries. And some of you might have to go to a native plant nursery to find, but these are available. And there are many others that are available in local nurseries that you can bring them into. These are all shade loving, by the way, shade loving plants. So if you've got a part of your yard that you're converting into a more natural wooded area, these are all things that would do well under the shade of those trees. And then the leaf litter layer. So this is very important. And I'm going to list three main reasons why it's important. First, the leaf litter layer is its own world. It's its own ecology, so to speak, and it's going to promote the best health for your woody plants. So you may have been in a talk earlier if you were in Building Healthy Soils or in Janine's thing on climate change about talking about how many organisms there are that live in the soil, in a healthy woodland soil. And that environment, all the processes that those insects and microinvertebrates and bacteria and nematodes and fungi are all in there working to to process organic matter and create nutrients that are available to the plants that have their roots in those soils. So that leaf litter performs a vital service that you don't get with a lawn. You get a lot of competition from a lawn, but you don't get nutrient cycling in a lawn. Also, it provides habitat for ground feeding birds and ground nesting birds, because there's actually quite a few insects in that leaf litter layer, and there are critters that want to come into your yard and search through that leaf litter and find their morning meal. This next bullet, 94% of species of caterpillars that feed on oaks drop to the forest floor to overwinter in or under leaf litter. That's something that came out of Douglas Tallamy's most recent book, The Nature of Oaks. And I found that fascinating because I was, being a forester, I was just completely unaware of that. So basically what he's saying there is that you've got a canopy, you've got a habitat that you're attracting, or we are attracting butterflies and moths to, and they're going to lay their eggs somewhere in that canopy, and those little larvae are going to get out and they're going to start feeding on the leaves. And once they've gotten big and fat, and they're big and fat caterpillars, now they need to pupate, and then they're going to, after they pupate, they're going to emerge from their pupa and become an adult. But oftentimes these animals will spend a significant amount of time in a pupal stage. Oftentimes they overwinter in a pupal stage. And so they need to have a place to do that. Many caterpillars will do that in the canopy. They'll hide under a bark, they'll attach themselves to a twig or a leaf, they'll disguise themselves so that they look like a leaf or a dead leaf, thinking everybody's going to leave them alone. But a lot of them, and 94% of the ones that feed in the oaks, drop out of that canopy and go down into the leaf litter layer, where they hide either among the leaves or they burrow down a little bit into the soil, just that top layer of soil. If we don't have that leaf litter, if we've planted our tree in a lawn, we then are creating what's like an ecological trap, where we're inviting a certain stage or two stages. We're inviting the butterflies and the caterpillars to come and think that they're home there. But then when they drop out of those canopies, they don't have the habitat to complete their final life cycle, to complete that last stage of that life cycle, to come back as adults or to emerge as adults. So this leaf litter, we're finding more and more just how important it is. And the picture on the far right is just something that was pulled out of a forest near where I work. And this was just at the base of an oak tree, and how much leaf litter there was. These are all roots of the various trees around there and shrubs that were weaving their way through this wonderfully thick layer of organic matter, mostly just decomposing leaves. So I can't emphasize that enough. Make use of it, bring it into your yard, and see how that can transform what you're able to do ecologically. So sources of trees. You've probably heard of Plant Nova natives, so this is a link to them. Somebody might want to capture that and put it in the chat as a live link. I know it's been put in some other chats, so you might have it already. They have good lists of native plant nurseries, as well as local retail garden centers and nurseries that don't sell only natives, but do sell some natives. So I'm not going to mention any names, but there are some major garden centers around our area. If you go there, you can find native plants of all different kinds, even though the bulk of what they're going to sell is non-native. Another source of trees, and we're getting less expensive here, is Friends with Woods. That's a picture from my backyard, where I have pulled some of those trees. Those are all species of trees. I think there's at least 8 different species of trees that were growing either in my yard, and I wanted a perennial bed, not a shady bed, and I only have a townhouse, so I couldn't let trees come up in my backyard. So rather than waste them, I just dug them out and put them in a pot. And then I'm going to find people to give them away to. Matter of fact, if you come to the Bluebell Festival in April 10th, I believe it is, Sunday, I will have some of these there. And if you walk up to me and you say, Julie, saw your program back at the Native Plant Symposium, got any of those trees left? I would be happy to give you one of these guys to take it back and plant it in your yard, because it won't fit in my townhouse. I also got some of these from my dad's yard, who backs to a 7-acre woodland that's parkland. And I also have a perennial bed that I've been tending in his yard. And I don't want trees to come up into it. So I probably, at least half of these, I've pulled out of my dad's yard. And quite honestly, I could have pulled at least 3 times this many out. And we'll continue to pull them out next year, I'm sure, because he's got all these native trees that are around him that are seeding into his property that he doesn't want growing there. So find a friend with woods. Get some pots and then go over and say, hey, before you kill that tree, maybe you can just let me dig it up, and I'll bring a little extra soil to fill the hole back in. And then acorns and other things. This I find, the picture I took in a forest, and to me, it looks like a cheeseburger with a tongue. But what it actually is an oak acorn. And that red thing is the root radical that it's gravitationally pulled, comes out and goes down and gets into that soil. And the oak, the first thing the oak does is put down its root. And then once it's got its root established in the soil, it'll put out a couple of leaves and start to grow vertically. So if you can catch oaks before they get to this stage, and you've got viable acorns, you can find these all over the place. They are free for the taking in most situations, and you can take them home and let it do its thing like that in a pot in your house. There are different kinds of plant stock you can purchase. On the upper left, we start with the cheapest kind, that you're going to actually go to a nursery and buy, and that is bare root stock. As it says, there's nothing around the roots. The roots are exposed. They have to be kept moist and cool, and it's wise that as soon as you get them, you plant them within a few days. They are often available through the Virginia Department of Forestry. Actually, they're always available through the Virginia Department of Forestry, and they're very inexpensive. Next, down in the lower left, we have tublings. These are little 3 by 3 inches at the top and probably about 9 inches deep. These are usually available through companies that sell to reforestation efforts. They probably, cost about $3 to $4 each. And so they're still pretty inexpensive. And you might have to go and pick them up yourselves because they probably won't deliver unless you buy a whole bunch of them. Then you go to 1 gallon pots. You're still getting maybe like a 2 or 3. Here's some 1 gallon over here. So maybe 2 to 3 feet tall, maybe 4 foot tall at the outside. So they're still this little seedling, but they are less expensive that way. And next comes whips, which are called whips because generally they're tall and very unbranched. These happen to be fairly well branched. And this family, I'm just going to pause and say, they came to 2 of our reforestation projects, and this is one of them that they're standing in here. What a wonderful mom bringing her sons out. They were just a blast, and they found a turtle, which made their day. And then you can have different kind of more larger stock, like 2-inch caliper stock, meaning referring to how big in diameter the tree is at its base. This is what you typically see being put out in many people's front yards or in commercial scapes. And you can buy them either in a container in which all the root system is located in that container. When you buy the plant, you buy the whole root system that it grew with, or balled and burlapped. Balled and burlapped are field-grown trees that they've had their root systems cut, and then what remains is covered up in burlap and shipped. Sometimes this works really well, but you have lost a significant amount of the root system when you buy a balled and burlap tree. And so you do need to take good care of it when you're putting it in the ground. And I do want to talk for just a minute about cultivars. And how do you know whether or not you're getting a really truly native plant? So pay attention to the label. So when you're buying a straight native, that would be like Cornus Florida. So here, ignore the Cherokee Chief here. You want just the straight native, that's going to be Cornus Florida. How do you know if you're getting that? Well, if you find a label like yellow, this one is going to be yellow trout lily, which is not even a tree, but we're going to use it. Yellow trout lily is a native herbaceous plant. Erythronium americanum is the species name, or the scientific name. Erythronium is the genus, americanum is the species, like Cornus is the genus and Florida is the species. If you want to buy just the straight species, then you never want to see a little single quote on either side of it, because that means that it's been specifically bred apart from the straight species. So straight species will have the genus and the species of a native plant and nothing after that, like this, yellow trout lily, Erythronium americanum. That's the straight species. Now, you could buy a native that's been cultivated for a particular characteristic, and that's where we run into this Cherokee Chief flowering dogwood as an example. Cherokee Chief flowering dogwood, the fact that it's got something in front of flowering dogwood helps you know that it's been some kind of breeding has been done with it. It's got a single quote, Cherokee Chief. What that means that native species of flowering dogwood has been cultivated, probably through cloning, to consistently produce a characteristic. In this case, it's a very deep red flower. Cherokee Chief has a very deep red flower, and they want to be able to repeat that so that they can grow it consistently and consistently sell you a flowering dogwood with a deep red flower. So in this case, the single quote indicates the combination of the native genus plus the native species plus the single quote Cherokee Chief lets you know that this is the native flowering dogwood, but it has been bred for a specific characteristic. Okay, now things that aren't native, things that are hybrids, that's going to be, look at this Coreopsis buttercream over here. So here you see Coreopsis is tick-seed sunflower not tick-seed sunflower, tick-seed Coreopsis or threadleaf Coreopsis, or there's various species of Coreopsis, many of which are native in our area. But what you notice in this label is there's no species. You've got Coreopsis, which is the genus, and again, Coreopsis, which is the genus, but you have no species, no species. Instead, what you have is a single quote and then buttercream. So what this is telling you is that this particular plant has been hybridized with something other than, with another species, possibly a non-native species. You just simply don't know because they're not telling you. They're not telling you what the parents of this plant are. But you can tell it's not a native because it does not give you the species. So if I were out in a nursery and I wanted to buy a flowering dogwood and all it said was Cornus and didn't give me the Florida, I would not buy it because I don't have any assurance that what I'm looking at is the native species. Same with the Coreopsis. I would not buy Coreopsis buttercream because I'm trying to get the native. I want to know if it's Coreopsis versicolata, which is the threadleaf. If you give me that species, then I'll know. But since you're not, I don't know. So let's bypass that one and go for something that we know is native, okay? So here's some aids for plant selection. These are free, downloadable PDFs online. Somebody wants to capture those and put them into the chat, that would be cool. So native plants for wildlife habitat and conservation landscaping, that's this one up here. This is a real nice brief, but very thorough list of plants in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, all native plants. And it gives you, I use it a lot actually in my work. And it gives you a little synopsis of like, is it like wet or soils or dry soils? Is it like full sun or part shade? How big does it get? Is it good for songbirds or pollinators? That kind of thing. Gives you a really nice breakdown. Similarly, native plants for Northern Virginia does a very similar work. And it's a little bit shorter list. This tends to have a more extensive list. It covers wetland plants or emergent plants, herbaceous plants, grasses. So you get a really thorough list with both of these. So those are good references if you happen to be in the Northern Virginia or DC metro area. And so is a plant native in your region? How do you know? Well, there's some ways you can find out. One is Plant Nova Native's website. And again, there it is again. Another one is in Prince William County, we have a document called the Design and Construction Standards Manual, DCSM for short. In section 800, there's a plant selection guide, and that lists trees, shrubs, perennials, and ornamental grasses. And by each one of those plant species, there is going to be a column that contains the letter N if it's native. So you can download that one and you'll have a very local product, but that is not necessarily, it's native to Virginia, not necessarily native to Prince William County. And then if you were listening to Matt Bright, he gave a couple other sources there, which I did not have listed here. I did not know about Earth Sango's site. So now I've got another site that I can explore and find out what lists of native plants he has. So what if you live someplace else? Across the United States, I love using the USDA plants database. This graphic is from that. And when you go onto the USDA plants database, it's good to have the species, the genus and the species, or at least the genus, so that you can get to the species. And you will pull up something that has very general information, but it also has these wonderful maps. As you zoom into that map, you get county information. So now you zoom in far enough and you can see what counties it's been documented in. And they're not necessarily complete. So if there was, for example, a gap in this one that didn't show Prince William County, which is right up in here, it didn't show that one having this, in this case, flowering dogwood. If it didn't have that in there, but I happen to know that it's all around that area, I would feel very comfortable planting flowering dogwood with the confidence that it just simply hadn't been documented yet in my particular county. Down at the bottom, you see the green. The darker green is that's native range. The lighter green, like up in here in Maryland, means that they don't have any county data, but they do know that it's native in that state. If you see blue, that indicates that plant has been introduced. Again, light blue, introduced, but they don't know exactly where. And I'm not quite sure what both means. We'll have to figure that one out. Okay, well, that's all I have. And hopefully we've left some time for questions.
Julie, we got a number of questions.
Okay.
I'm going to go back to the beginning here. I've held off on the questions as you've gone through. I also plan to put in the chat a number of the websites you mentioned.
Thank you.
So we should be good there. And again, remember everybody that this is you're going to get a recording of this. So if you want to go back and look through some of the specifics, you can definitely do that. As I'm scrolling way back to the beginning here. Okay, here's one of the first ones. I'd love to build the soil on my property, which was logged a few years ago. I also like to grow fruit trees and plan to have a few greenhouses. So unobstructed sunlight is important. What type of plantings would you recommend? The property is 10 acres.
So, so you're building a greenhouse, you're thinking you want to put some fruit trees in, you've had the site logged, and then the question is, can you be specific? I'm sorry, I'm not sure I heard the question in there.
Yeah, just basically, what type of plantings would you recommend for a logged over property that the owner wants to put some greenhouses up and also grow fruit trees?
Well, since it's logged, I'm going to presume it was clear cut so that it's completely logged, and so you have a very sunny environment. So you would look at you could do that in a couple of different ways. You could basically decide what it is you want to reestablish. Matt Bright had a question similar to this in how he responded to it, similar in that when you've got a completely removed forest, you can choose to go a couple different directions as to how you reestablish a forest. I'm presuming you want to reestablish a forest. Since you've got it cleared, you could start with an earlier successional stage in which you're picking species that tend to grow in an old field kind of scenario. So you would pick things like eastern red cedar, Virginia pine, maybe some loblolly pine now because those are actually invading old fields, black cherry, persimmon, and maybe do some shrub species like winged sumac or smooth sumac that really like a very open, sunny environment. So that would be kind of looking at it as saying, I'm going to establish more of an early successional forest. But since you already have soils, even though they've been kind of trampled on and pushed around, you still have probably, I would think, a fair amount of that leaf litter available, and the topsoil probably has not washed away, I would hope. So you could go ahead and say, well, I'm just going to reestablish an older type of, not an older type of forest, but a later successional type of forest where you were bringing in things like oaks and cherries and maples and hickories and things along those lines. So you can go either way. The main thing you're going to want to be sure about is that you're picking plants that can handle full sun because they're going to have full sun for a while. And normally when I plant into a very open area, it's kind of like a reforestation. You can use smaller plant material, you can plant densely. And then if you're going to just let it go and become a natural forested area, if you have other woods nearby, those trees are very likely to contribute their own seeds and begin to thicken up that area and make it close into a regular forest more quickly. But you're going to have a period of time where it's going to be very young and very sunny. And it's going to also be very dynamic. So you can let kind of nature take its course. You're probably going to need to control invasive plants, non-native invasive plants, but you can let nature take its course in terms of competition, and some plants will die out because they get outcrowded by other plants. I hope that hits what you were looking for. If not, maybe put something else in the chat, or if we don't have like a really, well, we have quite a few people, but if you wanted to unmute and explain your question more, I could possibly give you a somewhat modified answer.
I'll mention Julie has replanted a number of areas, and obviously a number of areas in the county on county land. And one of them is Bristow Battlefield out in Bristow. So if you walk the trail there, you'll notice we're probably, what, 4 or 5 years in, Julie? To
2017, so we're 5 years in.
We're 5 years in, and you can really start to see what's happening after 5 years of reestablishing a forest. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a good place to go see how it can look after only 5 years when seedlings have been put in. And it's got, I think, Brendan, you were involved in some of the early maintenance of that, in which the park let a lot of field areas go. They let it go to meadow before we brought the trees in. So it has a wonderful complement of native meadow-like plants in there. And the bird life there is really busting loose, I think. So it's a cool project.
Yeah, for those reasons, it's also, like I said, it's got meadows as well, so it's a great area to go to see. But there's a significant amount of new tree cover along the riparian area, and also they had been historically forested, so we put that back too. So there's a number of reasons to do it, but it's a great place to take a hike. It's local, and you get to see the work in progress.
And someone asked where that is. It's called Bristow, Bristoe, Bristow Station Battlefield Heritage Park. It was part of the Civil War, two significant Civil War battles. It's out near Bristow, Virginia, west of Manassas, south of Gainesville. So it's, if you're in Prince William County, it's quite local.
Yeah, it's right off 28. The best way to get to it is look for the brewery on the Route 234. You'll see it. It's not far from there. So other questions? Maylene has got to replace a number of close to 24 ash trees lost by the emerald borer. What would you recommend there?
To replace ash trees? Without really knowing kind of where they are, ash trees are fairly wide-ranging in where they can live. So it would depend upon whether you're looking at a moist site or a dry site. Ashes tend to be an early successional tree. So you might, I'm not sure if they're part of an existing forest or not, but you could, again, you want to just pay attention to sunlight and moisture. So I would suggest getting one of those guides and looking at the area. Your choices are really going to be, or should be, based on, to some degree, what kind of soil you have, what kind of moisture regime you have, and what kind of sunlight you have. Those are all the sort of the three main things that are going to impact how a tree is going to do in that area. A lot of our trees are very adaptable to a variety of environments, but it's better to know what you're putting it into and think about what you're putting it into, and then make your choice by reading about those different selections. And something like that Chesapeake Guide or the Northern Virginia Natives will give you a species and then tell you, oh, this likes moist soils, or this likes wet soils, or this likes full sun, or this likes full shade. And then you can use that to make your plant selections.
Okay, there were some questions about you mentioned the Bluebell Day. That's on April the 10th, I think, you mentioned?
Yeah, it's a Sunday. I believe it's April 10th. It's at Merrimack Farm Wildlife Management Area in Prince William County. It is free. And if you've not been down to see the bluebells that are along the Cedar Run floodplain, it is spectacular. It's a very family-friendly event. There are guided tours that take place like every 20 minutes. There's a different subject matter. The leaders of the tour will cover a different subject matter, and they can take you on a guided tour that's probably about an hour long to go down to the floodplain and see the bluebells, or you can go on your own. You can just come and travel on your own and go down and see the bluebells. They're really lovely and worth coming to see.
And just folks, I put the address in the chat. So that's it. Yeah, as Julie said, that's an excellent chance to see the bluebells. We also have Dove's Landing Park in Mid-County that also has an extensive floodplain along the Occoquan River that has beautiful bluebells as well. So I know that's not what we're talking about, but the question was asked. So question about water oaks. I guess that means Robin Allman asked this question. So if you want to unmute and be more specific, but I'm assuming that's oaks along wet areas.
My water oak is actually in a very dry area. Just some general characteristics. Anything you want to talk about?
You're saying water, W-A-T-E-R?
Correct.
Okay. I have limited experience with water oaks. I lived in a townhouse. Here's most of my experiences. I lived in a townhouse, and there was a water oak next door, which was huge, and it was in a dry area. Because the name water oak, I know it does handle wet soils, but amazingly enough, a lot of tree species that can handle very wet soils can also handle very dry soils. There's some that's not true of, but it is true of something like, say, a sycamore, which can really take be in a hard area like a parking lot island where it's very droughty, and they can handle that as well. So water oak seems to be one of those trees. It does get huge. It does produce acorns. It is not actually native to Northern Virginia, more so down to Southeastern Virginia and then points south from there. So that's about all I can tell you about it. I don't have a ton of experience with it because it's not commonly used up in our area.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes left, so I'll try to get through some more of these questions. Patty has a red maple on a property and has experienced erosion and also girdling. What's the best thing to do for this tree? I've actually got the same issue on my property.
Well, if you've got erosion, probably the best thing to do is find a way to fix that erosion. If you're losing, I'm not sure why the erosion is occurring. So probably try to figure out what it is that's washing away the soil and remedy that. And so you stabilize it. You're not just continuing to wash away the soil. The girdling root, I'm going to guess that the reason you have a girdling root is because this was a red maple that was purchased in a nursery. And oftentimes red maples are one of a few different kinds of species that are prone to getting girdling roots because actually a lot of them are prone to it. If it was grown in a container, the root will hit the wall of that container and then it'll just start to circle around. If it gets then planted out into your yard and somebody doesn't cut that girdling root, then it just continues to grow in that circle and will eventually squeeze into the trunk of the tree and begin to weaken and cause. And one of the things you tend to see with the girdling root is some decline, even localized decline within the canopy of the tree. What you can do, depending upon how bad it is, you can have an arborist come out to your property, excavate around that girdling root and saw it off. It probably would not, it depends on how bad it is, but and oftentimes if it's not that bad, you can saw it off without really doing any great damage to the tree. So that would be my recommendation for that. On the erosion, I'm sorry, I don't know how to answer that other than you should fix it. You should find out what's causing it to erode and fix it. If you need to bring in soil for soil that's lost, I would just say, try not to do more than 4 inches of soil that you're bringing into that root system, 6 at the very max, because once you bring in more than that depth of soil, you're starting to suffocate roots that have gotten used to having oxygen. So that would be the only thing I can think to suggest there.
Okay, I think we're going to get kicked out here quickly, but Victoria, you wanted to get unmuted so that you could ask a question. Go ahead.
If she can't unmute, we will be around for the next half hour. We're going to all go back into one big meeting. And then if you have additional questions, feel free to come into that one big meeting, and we're going to take on a variety of questions.
Okay, I appreciate everything I've learned here today. This is a wonderful forum. So my question, you really answered my question. So I just want to thank you for that. I was just looking for like basic guidance because what I have is this large property that I'm not going to use fully for, to live on, to grow on. I would like it to be native. I would like it to be as natural as possible. So you did answer that. And I was just looking for kind of some guidelines on what I should be doing towards that. So thank you guys. Yeah, so.
Well, Victoria, let me just say that, are you in North Carolina or Maryland or where?
I am North Carolina, right over the Virginia line.
Okay, you may have like we have, where we have a local or regional foresters that are part of our state Department of Forestry. You may have that in North Carolina. So I would check into that. Our foresters here come out and consult with landowners about how to do forestry on their, not necessarily forestry as in I want to harvest timber, but even urban type of forestry where I want to reestablish native plant communities. And or you can work with your cooperative extension or your native plant society, get to know those groups, and they may be able to provide you with additional local help.
Definitely, and I will. Thank you, guys.
Okay, Brendan, are we supposed to go back to the big group now?
We are. I'm sorry, I was on mute. So a lot of kudos on the presentation, Julie. So great job. Everybody's very appreciative. Now, when you leave this, you'll be going back to the main group, and you'll be able to ask more questions of all of the speakers. So it's been a great morning, and I hope you all had a great time. Thank you.
See you back in the main group.